Hello everyone, I am the Medic Kirby, and welcome to my channel, The Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews and other deck techs. On this episode of The Brewery, I'll be discussing my take on a commander from Jumpstart 2022, Kenessos, Priest of Thassa. If you like this deck or any of the cards I'll be mentioning throughout the video, please consider using my TCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find that link down in the description. It'll really help out the channel. But the very best way you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. There are plenty of perks for being a patron, such as early access to certain videos, exclusive deck techs, gifts, and more. You can also support my channel for free by simply liking, subscribing, and sharing, which also helps out a lot. I put out a video every Monday, so you don't want to miss out. You can join my Discord server for free if you want to join the Commander Tavern community. All pertinent links are down in the description. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Kenessos is a 1/3 Merfolk Cleric for 1 generic and 1 blue. However, since he has an activated ability with a green-blue hybrid mana cost, he has a green-blue color identity. With this ability, you pay 4 mana to look at the top card of your library. If it's a Kraken, Leviathan, Octopus, or Serpent creature card, you could put it straight onto the battlefield. Not only is this ability super busted, but if it's not any of these sea monsters, you could just bottom deck the card if you wanted to. On top of that, Kenessos has a replacement effect where if you would scry any number of cards, you scry that many plus 1 instead. This meshes well with his activated ability since it's a form of top deck manipulation that can help you make the most of his other ability. Paying 4 mana to cheat in a huge beater is definitely something this format loves doing. In fact, it might even be less thanks to Biomancer's Familiar and Hearthstone reducing the generic cost of his activated ability. Unfortunately, Hearthstone is a symmetric effect, but it's way cheaper than Training Grounds, which is currently 6 times as expensive. In any case, having both of the effects in play essentially turns Kenessos into a pay 1 green or blue mana to cheat in the top fatty of your library if it's a sea monster. Super busted. Now, Kenessos is obviously a tribal commander, but for 4 different creature types, which is definitely more useful for building a deck around, since this gives us access to more options. Having huge sea monsters to cheat in is definitely a plus, but there are also many of these creatures that have amazing abilities besides just being huge. Also, a lot of the real big ones have too many drawbacks to warrant considering for this deck, but we can make do with what we got. Acquisition Octopus and Sea Dasher Octopus help with drawing us cards whenever they or the creature they're attached to deals combat damage to a player. These creatures are also cheap enough to cast if we have them in our hand, which is great. Sea Dasher Octopus is definitely something you want to mutate onto a bigger or more evasive creature though. Storm Surge Kraken can also draw us cards, but whenever it gets blocked. It has hexproof and gets even bigger if you control Kenessos. There will come a time when defending player will not want to get smacked with the 7/7 and will then start drawing you 2 cards each time it's chump blocked. And if nothing else, it's still 7 damage going across the table. Biblioplex Kraken and Octoprophet synergize even further with our commander since they scry when they enter the battlefield. Scrying is very important to Kenessos, but we'll see the dedicated slots for that in the deck a bit later. At least these are also relatively cheap to cast, so no need to really have to cheat them into play. Best of all, the Kraken has a built-in way to not only bounce creatures, but to also become unblockable. So bouncing Octoprophet or any other ETB creature in the deck can be very useful. Speaking of being unblockable, Deep Sea Kraken and Tidal Kraken are some amazing beaters in the deck because they're straight up unblockable. The best thing about Deep Sea Kraken is that if it were stuck in your hand, we can simply suspend it for 3 mana. Yes, it does get 9 time counters on it, but in a multiplayer game of Commander with 3 opponents casting multiple spells per turn, it'll enter from exile in no time. Wormhole Serpent can make any creature unblockable, but it does cost 4 mana to activate. At least it can be done multiple times since it doesn't require tapping, like Rogue's Passage, which is also included in the deck. That being said, it's a relatively cheap to cast sea monster if we're stuck with it in our hand. Plus, it can help a huge beater get through uncontested. However, the very best way to make our sea monsters unblockable is thanks to Serpent of Yawning Depths. The other sea monster lord in the deck, this card is absolutely busted here. Not only is it a 6/6 for 6 mana, but it's essentially making our whole board unblockable. Well, not really unblockable since an opponent would be able to block with any changeling or sea creature of their own. But really, are Krakens, Leviathans, Octopi, and Serpents that common of a creature type in Commander nowadays? Anyways, this helps us end games, especially with beaters like Inkwell Leviathan and Simic Sky Squallower. These are included because they are essentially huge damage dealers that have some form of built-in protection and evasion. They are quite hefty to hard cast though, so hopefully we can cheat them into play with Kenessos or the other ways the deck has to do so. Nadir Kraken and Spawning Kraken do their best to fill our board with even more beaters. Well, the tentacle tokens created by Nadir Kraken are more for chump blocking than anything, but at least it gets +1/+1 counter with every trigger paid. Spawning Kraken is absolutely busted here though, especially if most of our huge beaters are getting through anyways. The Sea Monster Lord creates a 9/9 Kraken for each sea monster that deals combat damage to an opponent. A 9/9. Best of all, it doesn't matter the size. So if we're connecting with something like Octoprofit, Sea Dasher Octopus, etc., we're still getting a 9/9 Kraken token, which can itself also continue creating 9/9 Kraken tokens when connecting. Absolutely busted. Some more useful sea monsters include AC Tyrant of the Gyre Strait and Arachmithes Slumbering Isle. These help with mana acceleration, but we'll see the rest of the deck's mana acceleration pieces further along in the video. AC is already an amazing card on its own since it helps us pay an additional land per turn, so it's also common to see across the table, so keep that in mind when attacking with Serpent of Yawning Depths in play. Arachmithes is also relatively cheap to cast, but it's not a creature while it has counters on it, but that's fine since it can tap for green and blue in the meantime. But once it's online, it is a 12/12 beater, much to our opponent's chagrin. Icebreaker Kraken, Hullbreaker Horror, Cataract Leviathan, Coma Cosmos Serpent, and Storm-Timed Leviathan are some more amazing sea monsters in the deck because these have an element of disruption to them, which I absolutely love my creatures having. Icebreaker Kraken costs a whopping 12 mana to cast, but since the deck is running 11 Snowlands, it's actually easier to cast. That being said, hopefully we get it off of Kenessos more often than not. In any case, it freezes all of target opponent's artifacts and creatures, which is great at keeping them tapped down to make it easier to swing into them. It can also be bounced at instant speed by bouncing 3 Snowlands. This should be done in case of emergencies only though, although it's great at keeping an opponent tapped down when combined with AC. But if used as a beater afterwards, you still have an 8/8. Hullbreaker Horror is absolutely busted, even more so if cheated onto the battlefield. If not, at least it has flash. But once it's there, every time you cast a spell, you can either bounce a non-land permanent or bounce a spell you don't control right off of the stack. This is great for using those scry instants in the deck for more than just scrying. If that weren't enough, it's also a 7/8 beater. Cataract Leviathan is essentially a symmetric overloaded Cyclonic Rift when it enters the battlefield. It does cost 8 to cast though, but if you're in dire straits, then bouncing everything back while staying behind is still useful. It also has an unearth cost equal to overloading Cyclonic Rift. I keep mentioning, but it's because it's also included in the deck, since what better way to screw over opponents than overloading this. Not only is it amazing defensively, but also proactively at the end of the turn before ours, to then swing in with our massive army of sea monsters. That being said, this Leviathan is a use only in emergency kind of thing. Coma is another sea monster that creates sea monster tokens, which is amazing. Best of all, it's each upkeep, so you're essentially getting 4 of them each turn around the table. If that weren't enough, you can sacrifice another Serpent to either tap down a permanent and take away its activated abilities, or give Coma indestructible. This card is an absolute house here, especially since you can deactivate Planeswalkers at instant speed, or any other permanent with activated abilities, as well as tapping down potential blockers. Last but definitely not least is Storm-Timed Leviathan. Not only does this 8/8 for 8 have built-in evasion in its Island Walk, but it also turns all lands into islands in addition to its other types. So it's essentially a Yavimaya Cradle of Growth, but for islands. Yavimaya is also included in this deck for color fixing. Having both essentially turns all lands into play into tropical islands. That being said, it's not all hugs since it prevents all creatures without flying or Island Walk from attacking. Granted, this is not a creature you want in play against a deck with plenty of flyers, but having it does shut down a lot of aggro decks without flyers. It's also able to attack any other player without being blocked, so it's quite the beater too. Having a vast majority of these sea monsters have a huge power stat is also a plus whenever they enter the battlefield, thanks to cards like Elemental Bond, Garruk's Pack Leader, Garruk's Uprising, Hero Behemoth Beckoner, Guardian Project, and Soul of the Harvest. Although the first 4 triggers are dependent on high enough power, most of the time the trigger will occur since most of the creatures in the deck are big enough. The last 2 don't care about power, so they're even better. The creatures just can't be tokens. Some more synergistic draw in the deck is via Greater Good. This enchantment also draws us a ton of cards. I've had this in play and with quite the grand response to a board wipe by sacrificing all of my creatures to draw into insane amounts of cards. It's still amazing even with sacrificing just 1 fatty. So much so that Reliquary Tower is also included. This doesn't even take up a slot in the deck, so you might as well, especially since it can eventually become an island and or a forest. Speaking of lands, the deck also wants to scry enough to make it worth it. Kenessos lets us scry an additional card each time, but scrying is also a great way to filter through the top of the library, as well as helping leave a sea monster on top. So lands like Crystal Grotto, Temple of Mystery, and Zalfarin Void are great. They don't take up slots in the deck, and they scry 1 the moment they hit the battlefield. While only happening on ETB might seem like a bummer, it's basically a free scry 2 with our commander out. Castle Vantress, Isolated Watchtower, Quandrix Campus, and Soldevi Excavations do it better though, since they're repeatable while also not taking up slots in the deck. Some of these require quite the mana investment to do so, but at least they're effectively mana sinks to help set it up at the beginning of the end step before our turn. The last one doesn't have the word scry printed on it, but its last ability has since been errated to simply say scry 1. It also taps for 2 mana, which is great. You do have to sacrifice an untapped island when it enters the battlefield, but at least it doesn't enter the battlefield tapped. Besides these lands, the deck has plenty of repeatable scry abilities. Jace, Unraveler of Secrets, and Nissa, Steward of Elements are planeswalkers that can scry by gaining loyalty counters, which is great. They're also useful in other ways. Jace can bounce a creature, and his emblem is absolutely oppressive. Being able to protect him to ultimate is also quite possible when you're cheating in huge sea monsters. Speaking of, Nissa's zero loyalty ability is similar to Kenessos' activated ability. If Nissa had enough loyalty counters on her, which she can from the get-go since she enters the battlefield with X of them, you can essentially cheat into play any creature or land with mana value less than or equal to the amount of loyalty counters she has. Her ultimate isn't the point of running her, and we don't really need it, since we'd rather have her use the ton of loyalty counters anyways. Crystal Ball, Darksteel Pendant, Sealer's Lantern, and Treasure Map are some more ways to scry, and, like the lands, can be done so at instant speed. As with Soul Devi Excavations, Darksteel Pendant has since been errated to say scry 1. Each of these are relatively cheap to cast and activate, with the last two even providing mana acceleration. Best of all, Treasure Map can transform into a land, making it even more useful. Sure, we might rather be scrying, but we can't always just depend on Kenessos to get our sea monsters into play. Another Therosian and Thassa worshipper, Thrasius Trident Hero, has possibly one of the best scry abilities in the deck though. He can use his ability at instant speed and as often as you have the mana for. Thanks to the 2 cost reduction effects in the deck, you might even be able to do it for just 1 generic mana each time. Thassa God of the Sea and the Temporal Anchor are also in the deck and provide free scrying. Not only is running Thassa flavorful due to Thrasios being in the 99 and Kenessos being in the command zone, but she's also relevant to both of his abilities. You scry 1 at the beginning of your upkeep. But for 2 mana, you can make any creature unblockable, so you can sink your mana into making your biggest sea monsters guaranteed to get through to an opponent's face. On top of that, she only costs 3 to cast and is an indestructible 5/5. The Temporal Anchor is also absolutely busted here. Not only do you scry 2 each upkeep, but whenever you bottom deck a card due to scrying it, you can instead exile it and play it during your turn. This is amazing for lands you don't want to keep on top, but can then play from exile later. Obviously, we want to do this for lands and cheap spells since we want to keep our sea monsters on top. Opt, Preordained, Serum Visions, Reason to Believe, and Mystic Speculation are the deck's spells that use purely to scry and draw cards in a very cheap and efficient manner. These are obviously better with Kenessos in play, but are still good on their own to help us not run out of gas. Believe in particular is great because it's essentially a one-time use only way to perform Kenessos' ability in sorcery form, so it's better than the first 3 for it. However, the best one is still Mystic Speculation. Thanks to its buyback cost, you're essentially paying 3 to scry 3 and then get the spell back into your hand, so it's actually repeatable. It's definitely one of the best of these. Some more scrying spells are via Sapphire Dragon and Tel-Jalad Justice. Well, with Sapphire Dragon is whenever it attacks or blocks, but if you send it on an adventure via Psionic Pulse, doing so lets us counter a non-creature spell, which is amazing. It does cost a whopping 7 mana to cast from our hand or exile, but it is a 5/6 flyer. Tel-Jalad Justice is a one-time use only, but it also gets rid of an artifact while also scrying us too. Obviously, these aren't the only interaction spells in the deck, since it's also running Fierce Guardianship, an offer you can't refuse, Swan Song, Counterspell, Mana Drain, and Negate. While Sapphire Dragon is amazing here since it provides both interaction and then a consistent beater that scries, the deck still needs to protect its board state, as well as preventing the combo player from winning. Mystic Sanctuary is also included to top deck any of these spells, along with any other instant and sorcery in the deck. Best of all, it's fetchable at instant speed thanks to the deck's 7 fetch lands. A quick note on the fetch lands is that they're even better in this deck than at face value. Not only do they thin the deck of lands to make Kenessos' ability reveal less lands, but they can also help shuffle the deck after a bad bout of scrying or not having a sea monster on top. These lands are so good that if you can't afford any of the more expensive ones, I suggest swapping them out for the cheaper versions like Evolving Wilds, etc. Same with Sword of the Animus and Sword of Hearth and Home. Both swords are amazing on their own because they're ramping us for basic lands. While they also have other perks like Pump and Protection, as in the second sword's case, they're also essentially shuffling our library each time we attack, which is great at refreshing the top of it. Farseek, Nature's Lore, 3 Visits, Into the North, and Rapid Growth also do the same thing, but only once since they're sorceries. They're still amazing because they're the cheapest land-based ramp spells you can run, so they're useful in the beginning of the game or even at the very end. However, the best top deck manipulation effects for the deck are Sensei's Dividing Top and Scroll Rack. The top is way too overpriced on the secondary market for an uncommon, but it's so good in this deck. But if you don't have it nor can't afford it, don't worry too much about it. For just 1 mana, you can rearrange the top 3 cards of your library, which synergizes so well with our commander. Same with Scroll Rack. If we had any high mana value sea creature stuck in our hand, not only are we top decking it in order to then cheat it onto the battlefield with Kenessos, but we're also simultaneously drawing cards too. These artifacts are amazing here. In Search of Greatness and Kodama of the East Tree are some more amazing cards that synergize with our commander. The enchantment can help us cheat in a bigger sea monster from our hand, but if we don't, we still get an effect which is scrying 1, something Kenessos doesn't mind at all. So this enchantment does it all here. Same with Kodama. If we have fatties stuck in our hand, we can cheat them into play whenever any other fatty of equal or lesser mana value enters the battlefield, whether because we cast it or cheated it onto the battlefield with a different ability. We can even use it to accelerate our mana since it's technically having us play an additional land per turn whenever we play the first land. So Kodama makes Icebreaker Kraken even more backbreaking. Back to scrying, Elegeth Crossroads Augur is absolutely busted here. Granted, in most cases we'd rather be scrying than drawing, but Elegeth drawing us into a ton of cards is also welcome. Because if any of those expensive sea monsters get stuck in our hand, we'll eventually draw into things like Scroll Rack, Kodama, or In Search of Greatness. If that wasn't all, it's also a 5/6 flyer, which is quite the beater too. The rest of the deck is just the rest of the lands. Apart from the previously mentioned lands, the deck is running Breeding Pool, Rimewood Falls, Tangled Islet, Dreamroot Cascade, Command Tower, and Ancient Tomb, as well as 3 snow-covered forests and 7 snow-covered islands, in order to make the most of the basic land wrap effects in the deck, as well as the few cards that are better for the deck for having snow lands in it. As with all of my deck techs, you can build your mana base according to your budget. Whether you include more expensive cards or even cheaper cards is up to you. You do you. This brew is just an idea of how to build around Kenessos Priest of Thassa. I love these kinds of lords that affect more than just one creature type. I'm no stranger to these sea monster lords either. I have a deck tech video on Runo Stormkirk if you want to see this archetype, but from a blue-black lens instead of this green-blue one. That being said, if you're interested in the deck list of my spicy Kenessos brew, you can find a link to it down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the brewers, for their patronage. I'd also like to thank anyone participating in the poll that created this video. Also, I want to thank anyone using my TTG Player affiliate link. That also helps out the channel. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of the Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am the Meta Kirby, happy brewing and happy new year.